taking a look at the Dahlia stereo analog delay by Flower Pedals. Look, I feel like I can count on one hand the number of devices I've ever owned in the studio that felt like they threw me through a loop. Whether it was a workflow or a complexity thing, I'm very aware that my calling card on the internet is the demystification of complicated effect pedals. That my most successful videos on this channel are the video manualization of bound manuals, the kind of thing that doesn't fit on a one sheet. So you can imagine my surprise when Flower Pedals Dahlia stereo analog delay became another notch in that kind of mythological post that is pedals that really confused me at the outset. So let's get into it. This small enclosure houses two completely independent analog delays, two completely separate paths down the left and right channels with two completely separate sets of BBD analog delay chips. But before we get into the amount of complexity this brings to the table, I want to talk about my thoughts on it for just a second, and then we're really going to kind of dive into the kind of like understanding the workflow side of this, because if this is something you're interested in, I think understanding how to approach it is going to be incredibly important. So first things first, this is a true stereo analog delay, TRS in, TRS out, so be aware that you're going to need like a Y cable or whatever, as well as an adjustable either tap or expression inputs, and MIDI in and through on the top via 3.5 millimeter cables. This is not a delay using MN3005 chips. I can't recall off the top of my head what the chips being used in this device are. You have effectively 850 milliseconds of delay on either channel. That cannot be combined for like a super long delay. It is just the two completely independent paths. Your tones from this thing are going to be warm, not bright. They are going to be cozy, but they're not going to be the kind of thing that really jumps to the forefront of a mix and bites the way that some brighter analog delays do, but really kind of is the domain reserved for more tape delay functions. There are several different ways to apply stereo width in this pedal, and I love that. The tap tempo and the kind of core functionality of the pedal is easy enough to get around that it's quite nice, but if you want to get into the deeper stuff, it gets complicated quickly. So just be aware, we're going to do our best to kind of demystify how to approach this pedal in this video, but if you are somebody who kind of recoils against complexity, this is something that requires a surprising amount of buy-in for its kind of perceived size and form factor. But there are some amazing quality of life things at play here. Full MIDI integration is definitely one of them. The MIDI clock on this feels dead on. For the intro song and for our sound samples, we had the Hologram Chroma console on the board, basically just functioning as our reverb. But because the Hologram Chroma console has MIDI over USB-C, I was able to basically just USB-C from my computer to the Chroma console, and then 5-pin to 3.5 millimeter into this, and that got me crazy fast, crazy easy MIDI clocking to my project for this delay with no drift, no weird pitch bends when something hiccups along the way. It felt really rock solid as a MIDI kind of clocked delay, and I really like that because it's incredibly important to me when it comes to a kind of like MIDI delay that I might use in a live or studio setting. You of course have MIDI presets available with this thing, but you also have, I believe it's 5 built-in presets, which you can press and hold these two switches to get through. And there's a surprising amount of information conveyed across the literal 2 LEDs at the bottom of this pedal. The left one will flash different colors to tell you kind of like where the tap tempo subdivisions on delay 1 is, delay 2 is, that kind of thing. There is some really interesting kind of like visual information in something so compact and so kind of like focused. All that to say, I think it's a warm, wide sounding, pretty cool, if somewhat mellow analog delay. And if that's something that you're looking for, if you're looking for something that gives you that really kind of like warm, giant, wide, spacious analog delay sound, just kind of that lo-fi hug that good Bucket Brigade chips give you, this is a very strong showing from Flower Pedals. I think that the stereo widening effects, the dual delay width, and the stereo modulation in this thing all offer up really great sound design potentials. You heard on that intro track that between that kind of like general width that this offers and some of the really interesting ramping functionality that this thing has, that you can create create both conventional kind of smear from a bucket brigade delay on some of those lead parts, as well as some of those really wild pitch drops and Therme-esque pitch jumps that I had panned hard left and hard right for that intro track. It's a great way to just add character, movement, color, and some sense of kind of like surprise or tension into a production, which I quite like. So now let's talk about kind of how this thing is navigated before we get into our sound samples, because I just want to create some structure for understanding this thing, because I bounced off of this the first time I tried to like learn it. I really had a hard time understanding the workflow. So very quickly, let's overview that. And if you don't care about this and you just want to hear the sound samples, Timecodes down below. You have very, very simple unified controls across the pedal: mix, time, feedback, tone, your subdivisions, and your modulation. Every single one of those things can be applied to the left channel or the right channel or both channels using a toggle right here. Every one of those controls also has a submenu control as well. Pressing and holding your bypass switch will allow you to change ramping parameters across the top and submenu parameters across the bottom. The amount of gain applied to the delay, a thing called time lock, which we will get into in just a second, as well as a secondary control for that modulation, allowing you to adjust speed or depth on one knob, which is quite nice. You have two switches in the center of these knobs. The left one is going to be your stereo delay behavior, basically a mono series, one delay feeding into the other, a stereo, which is just proper, the two channels kind of existing, pulling from each of the channels, and then a parallel where you are getting your left channel from your left side and your right channel from your right side. In our video, we are doing everything mono in, stereo out, and so it's not really that important for our purposes, but if you are running a stereo in, stereo out rig, though differentiating between your stereo and parallel switches will be more important. On that same switch, you can also press and hold and adjust that to change between three modulation waveforms: triangle, sine, and a random square. And then the really important, and this is where things get a little bit more complicated, you have your second one, your second switch right here, which is going to control whether you are adjusting delay 1, delays 1 and 2, or delay 2. The submenu control for that, stay with me here, allows you to decide if the pedals kind of like two different delays operate as either width, independent, or division. And that's going to be controlled by pressing and holding and making those switches again. The three different modes kind of speak to what I was saying about kind of understanding how to navigate this pedal. You effectively have 4 different ways of setting up stereo image in the Dahlia. Mode number 1 is going to be the simplest, which is just kind of selecting one of the two different delay lines and applying modulation to that one, or applying different modulation rates to the two different delays. That will keep the delays locked in time together, but it will give you a sense of width because the modulation will be rising and falling on the left and right channels in different rates. Number 2, and this gets into actually using the delay lines for width, is that left position, which is width, which allows you to use that division secondary control to apply Haas effect stereo widening to the two delays that would otherwise be locked in time together. Number 2 is going to be independent, where you can literally use that time control to set any kind of delay time differences between your two delays, allowing you to be completely out of time, not at all locked together. And then number 3 is going to be subdivisions, which basically turns that time lock from a stereo widening tool and instead allows you to set separate subdivisions for delays 1 and 2. So like I said, I think this will all make sense as you get into these sound samples, but there's a lot of complication in this pedal, and your kind of like first blush of trying to get to know it might be, if you're anything like me, fairly trying. And I'm hoping the purpose of this video is to really get you familiar with it enough that if you do pick one of these up, you will go into it with a little bit of some kind of foreknowledge of what it is, because the manual for this is a 1 card, and I don't know that it's adequate for what needs to be done, like the work that needs to be done to understand this thing. So bear that in mind. Hopefully this video is useful. I think I'm out of breath from talking so much so quickly just now. Let's get into our sound samples. So as always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we're working in. I am playing my Music Man St. Vincent Goldie into the 29 Pedals EUNA, the Origin Effects Cali 76, and the Jackson Audio Asabi. From there we go to our amplifier, the Universal Audio Ruby 63, and mono into the Dahlia delay by Flower Pedals. We are going stereo out over TRS to the Chroma console by Hologram Electronics, and then to our DAW, which is Universal Audio's Luna. We are setting our input gain with a Neve 1073, and we are mixing and mastering with ATR tape and the SSL bus compressor. This is our dry tone. So we're going to try to divide up this delay into some real digestible sections. So we're going to start by taking a look at the kind of main control scheme. We've got the pedal in stereo mode. We've got our tone completely open, kind of all the crucial stuff up here around noon, and our modulation turned off, and our subdivision down at a quarter note. Let's start by taking a look at kind of that first layer of audio control, and then we will dive into our kind of some key secondaries like gain, dual band modulation, and then we'll start to dig into the kind of different ways you can pull stereo image out of this delay pedal. So a couple things to know. The mix control is only a volume control for the delay itself. It will not impact your dry signal at all. So we've got let's go ahead and take a look at the kind of min-max of that volume. Down here you have basically sub slapback, almost instantaneous. Which obviously can be cool for some kind of stereo widening, and we'll revisit that later, and it can also be used for some kind of chorusing effects. And then as you kind of take this thing up, you go from that kind of slapback up into kind of more conventional delay sounds. And of course, as you pass that noon point is where you start to kind of overclock the chips a little bit and get into a slightly more kind of white noisy aliased delay sound. And then here you will hear a lot more white noise in the signal. This is also a good opportunity to take a look at that tone control as we're rolling through this section, because you can use that. It's not like a tilt EQ or anything, it's just a low pass filter. So you can actually start to dial in something resembling a cleaner but darker delay to kind of mitigate some of that white noise if you want those longer delay times, but you don't want that kind of like added white noise. And of course, your feedback will take you down to a single repeat. It's kind of tuned to not get to that runaway oscillation thing any earlier than you want it to, and that's really nice for a reason we'll touch on in a little bit. I guess I'll let you in on that secret now just because this video is going to be long. The ramp controls up here, you've got this this tap tempo down here that can also function as a press and hold to ramp some combination of your time and your feedback. The ability to kind of set this to runaway, but also be able to set it to a like edge of runaway creates really interesting versions of that kind of press and hold to oscillate thing. So many delay pedals do the press and hold and then it just runs away and starts, breaking up like crazy. And this instead gives you the ability to kind of set how far you want that feedback to go, whether it's more or less, but to be able to fine tune these kind of like not fully chaotic running away oscillation points creates in my opinion, a better use for a ramp function like this. Like you can even hear right there, that holds on for a long time. You have to kind of really get all the way there. And play probably with that gain control a little bit to really make it run away. Yeah, we're not even getting runaway and it's totally maxed out right now. Maybe if we bring up the delay a little bit. Okay, let's press and hold and let's actually bring up that gain. Let's max that gain and in turn bring down our mix a little bit and turn the pedal back on. There it is. Your gain matters a lot. So I've been playing with that gain control as I've been fine-tuning delay sounds as well as getting to know the pedal and everything. So when you kind of have the gain further down like I did, that runaway oscillation is less hyper-present. Yeah, so let's go ahead and set that gain back down a little bit lower for clean repeats. But open that tone back up. And let's take a look at this modulation. So as you can hear, we are by default increasing the depth of the modulation. Obviously, there's a lot packed into this control scheme in this pedal. It's pretty aggressive in terms of what Flower has opted to put into the Dahlia. Most of these are denoted by the red as your primary and the white as your secondary. But obviously with modulation, you have red as your mod label, with depth kind of sub-labeled also in red, white as speed. So that is how you kind of differentiate that you are by default adjusting your depth. And then in turn, you can press and hold to adjust your speed. You can also mess with your modulation using this, the secondary controls on this switch up here, which we will come to when we get into our secondary control parameters and dive into that dual band modulation a little bit more heavily. I tend to like low depth in delay modulation. And let's actually use that modulation as our kind of step into our submenu control stuff. I know we touched on that gain a little bit already, but let's start by taking a look at that speed control. So let's bring up our modulation, or at least our depth. And you can hear that speed. Let's bring that depth way back down, so kind of like fast but shallow. Yeah, I like that quite a bit. Let's bring that speed down just a hair. Bring that depth back up a little bit. And give a listen to some of those other modulation shapes. So press and hold. We are in sine right now. We can jump over to triangle. Or jump over to a kind of like random square. It occurs to me in this moment that I forgot to talk about our subdivision control, but I also don't think I have to. It's, you know, tap tempo. You get it. It's subdivisions. Let's take it back to a quarter note. And let's take a look at that gain with a little bit more focus. So let's set our subdivision or our feedback to not run away. Let's set our mix to noon and our time to noon. We've got our tone wide open, and what you'll hear here is at minimum settings, you'll get kind of the most gentle version of your delay. You have to start kind of like really interacting with your mix and your feedback just to get it to kind of like show up, especially the way that we're running it right now, which despite being mini humbuckers and after our amplifier technically, we're still just not putting so much into the pedal volume wise. That it's gonna like remotely run away. There's just not enough energy being placed into that feedback loop for the delay. But this is also really useful because if you're using a pretty high gain setup, if you're using something that like outputs a ton of volume going into the front of the pedal, this might actually be really, really useful to be able to dial your gain control back this far. But in this context, you also just get like a really nice, pretty gentle repeat. And then again, we dial those back, and we can kind of start to ramp that gain up. So like, and you can hear if we go back to those settings again. We are getting much further towards that kind of like self-oscillating runaway thing. And then of course, if you really just want like gritty, aggressive repeats that will immediately run away. And apparently you can get some like really weird industrial techno from this. Yeah, there's some weird stuff in there. But yeah, the kind of high gain stuff gets really gritty. I tend to like to kind of like live somewhere in that kind of slightly north of noon, so I can get that self-oscillation if I want it. But a pretty gentle version of it where it will take a while to really fall apart the way that analog delays really can. And let's go ahead and take a look at our kind of like ramping controls here, because I think that'll be the next kind of piece before we get into the way that I want to talk about the stereo side of this pedal, because I've watched a couple things. Demos in the Dark did a great video on this. I've watched Flower Pedals like their own live stream where they walk through it, and I want to kind of approach it slightly differently. So before we get into that, let's take a look at our ramping. So basically, right now the way we have it set up is And that will kind of like ramp more towards a delay that holds for a lot longer. But you can set how quickly you ramp to the new settings and then what those settings are. So you can also do things like take that speed down to half and run it all the way to full self oscillation. And now we've got and of course, you hear that kind of like coming back up to pitch, and that's because we are holding our chord after the pitch shifting begins. If you don't want that to be the case, you can play your chord, let it go, and then pitch shift it down. Let's go ahead and speed up how fast that ramp happens. There we go. So fully clockwise is going to be the fastest version, and that will almost give you kind of like stepped mode, therme, quantized pitch shifting, depending on kind of how you have your time set for the two different speeds. Let's take that mix up a little bit higher. Give it a little bit of modulation. And like I said, you can also have it jump that other direction. Let's take it to our longest delay setting, have it really like fly upwards. Yeah, it's pretty rad. I like the way the ramping is implemented on this. It's more than just a press and hold to oscillate. It gives you a handful of other creative options available to you in this context, which is really cool. Like I said, there's a lot crammed into this thing. And with that in mind, let's go ahead and move into what I'm going to refer to as different forms of stereo implementation. Okay, so let's get into the kind of different ways that you can kind of pull stereo imaging and various different stereo delay implementations out of this pedal. So there's a few key things to know as we go into this section. You have three different kind of delay configurations on this left switch. You have three different what's called time lock settings on the right switch, and then your time lock down here as well as modulation. So that's the thing. So let's talk through what we're about to look at, and then we'll kind of go through each of the different versions of it. The way I like to kind of think about stereo image in a delay pedal is you can either set two totally freewheeling delay times on the left and right channels. You can take a kind of conventionally single delay line and apply stereo widening to it. You can run two different subdivisions, or you can apply stereo modulation. Those are the kind of different ways to create stereo width in a pedal. So let's start by taking a look at literally just applying stereo modulation to your delay to kind of get a stereo like image out of something like this. So we have our kind of like stock standard mono sounding delay. But because we are in stereo mode right now, if we turn this up, because we are adjusting both delay lines, you will still hear. And you can hear a little bit of stereo image just because of the way the chips are calibrated slightly differently and all that stuff. But if we go to adjusting delay line number 1 only, now only the left channel has modulation applied to it. So the delays are still hitting at the exact same time. And I can jump over to the right one and maybe like change the modulation wave shape and give it like a different amount of modulation. As you can hear, the delay lines are still completely in sync with one another. But we are applying different modulation waveforms, and that is what is creating our stereo image right now. And that can easily be undone by jumping back to this middle position that controls delay lines 1 and 2 and just making an adjustment. Oh, and reassigning them to the same modulation engine. So that is stereo modulation to apply kind of like width to a single consistent delay repeats. There are a few other ways in this pedal. We've got width, an independent setup, and divisions. So if we press down on our hold and jump over to width, this submenu control right here for time lock becomes basically a stereo widening tool. So we can kind of press and hold and dial that up. And now let's give where once again you can hear we're getting the same exact subdivision between the two delay lines. But you are just kind of like applying stereo widening to it. So and so for those of you not in the know, this form of stereo widening is typically referred to as the Haas effect, H-A-A-S. And it's basically just applying a kind of multi-millisecond delay to one side, keeping them generally pretty in sync, but very much giving you a sense of width between the two, but it can also make it feel like it's a little bit weighted to one side. And then you can kind of like do some added cool stuff by like bringing up your modulation. Next up you have, let's go ahead and bring that time lock back down. And then next up we have kind of independent in the center position here, where you are now basically, freewheeling your two delay lines together. Where you can go to one delay line, set something fast, the other one set something slow. And this is the full independent of the two delay lines. So, apply modulation to one, not to the other. You can kind of brighten up one, darken the other if you wanted to. Let's go ahead and have stereo 2, delay 1, and delay 2 have separate like feedback rates. Let's brighten both those back up. Yeah, you can hear it's very... And of course, in that context, you can also create some pretty wild and large sounding chorus sounds. And then jump back to the middle, kind of make an effort to reset everything as best we can, which always takes a little bit of doing. There we go. Back to business as usual. And then we have the kind of dual subdivision version of this, where you can use kind of main and control lock to set, you know, your quarter note for delay to line number 1. And then for delay line number 2. So now you've got... And of course, you can still apply your kind of like modulation and everything else. So yeah, there are a lot of interesting ways to kind of like make these two delay lines feel tight-knit, super wide, like one delay doing complicated things, or like multiple delays really kind of dancing around each other. There's a lot of customization and a lot of ways to achieve a stereo image in this pedal, which is pretty rad. And of course, all of this stuff is also available to you via MIDI. There's like a full MIDI rundown for everything, which is quite rad. And of course, let's go ahead and zoom out and reveal that we do in fact have the Chroma console up top here. And let's plug in this MIDI 5-pin to 3.5 millimeter, if I can find the jack. There we go, for our MIDI in. And now let's bring in the Chroma console, give us some reverb. And this is not using the tap on the side here. This is using MIDI in. I am now getting MIDI. Chroma console is sending MIDI to the Dahlia. And Chroma console, of course, if you've seen my video, has USB-C MIDI in via like through your DAW or whatever else. So on the intro track, I actually ran clock from my project into Chroma console and then out to the Dahlia, which basically keeps the Dahlia locked onto the grid for the entire project, keeping all your delay lines in time, which is really nice.